Jorell Vance, Mikah Thorne, and Sariah Elwood stepped out of a night filled with laughter, unaware that within seconds, a radicalized refugee lurking in the shadows would turn their celebration into a scene of unthinkable horror. The annual LGBTQ Arts Festival in Bristol had always been more than just a celebration. For many, it was a safe space, a day when the colors, music, and laughter drowned out the hate that still lurked in certain corners of the world. That night, the streets shimmered under strings of fairy lights, the air carrying the scent of street food mixed with cigarette smoke. Crowds moved between live performances and open-air bars, each corner filled with people embracing their identity without fear. Among them were three inseparable friends who had carved their place in the city's beating heart: Jorell Vance, Mikah Thorne, and Sariah Elwood. They had met years earlier during a college art program, quickly becoming more like family than friends. Each brought something unique to their little circle. Jorell, the tattoo artist, wore his craft like a second skin. His arms were a gallery of intricate ink, each piece telling a story about survival, freedom, or love. Mikah, with their sharp cheekbones and charisma, was the rising star of the city's drag scene. Every performance they gave turned into an unforgettable night, their costumes glittering under stage lights. Sariah, the bold activist, had a voice that could cut through noise like a blade, always speaking for those too afraid to stand in front of a crowd. On that night, they moved together through the crowd as if tethered by invisible thread. They stopped for drinks at a small pop-up bar where Mikah convinced them to try a brightly colored cocktail they'd never heard of. Jorell laughed so hard at Mikah's exaggerated disgust after the first sip that strangers around them started laughing too. Sariah took photos, determined to capture every small joy of the night. The music pulsed in the background, house beats blending with live saxophone from a street performer somewhere down the road. Every few minutes, familiar faces passed by to greet them. They were well known in the community, the kind of people others felt instantly safe around. It was the kind of night that felt untouchable, like nothing bad could ever cut into it. But just beyond the reach of the streetlights, someone watched. Al-Mansur had been standing alone near the corner of a closed record shop for nearly an hour. To most passers-by, he was just another quiet figure among many, a hood-covered part of his face, and his hands stayed tucked in his jacket pockets. He kept his gaze fixed on the trio, tracking their movements in a way that seemed casual to anyone who didn't look closely. He had seen them earlier that week outside Jorell's tattoo studio and recognized them instantly tonight. Each laugh they shared, each gesture, seemed to fuel something dark inside him. Karim had arrived in the UK 2 years earlier, fleeing conflict in his home country. At first, he had tried to fit in, working odd jobs, keeping to himself. But somewhere along the way, he fell into the grip of online spaces that reshaped his thoughts. Every video, every post reinforced a poisonous belief system that left no room for difference or compassion. The festival, in his mind, wasn't a celebration, it was an offense. And the three friends, so openly themselves, so visibly defiant of his warped worldview, became a fixation. Jorell, Mikah, and Sariah moved from one stage to another, never noticing the shadow that trailed them. They posed for a group photo with a drag queen they admired, bought hot churros from a food stall, and swayed together to a DJ's remix of an old disco track. Sariah teased Jorell for his bad dancing, while Mikah pretended to be too fabulous to join in. For them, the night was about friendship, about reminding each other that joy was an act of resistance. The thought that danger could be near never crossed their minds. Karim, however, thought of little else. His heart was steady, his breathing controlled. He had planned this in silence, without a single word to anyone. Tonight, he believed, would make his mark. And as the festival wound down and the friends began to drift toward quieter streets, his steps fell in line just far enough behind to stay unseen. The city, with all its music and lights, seemed unaware that three lives were now just minutes away from a darkness they would never escape. Karim's fixation had begun weeks earlier, long before the festival night. It started one gray afternoon when he passed a small public square where a local rally was taking place. A crowd had gathered around a makeshift stage, rainbow flags waving in the breeze. Sariah stood front and center, her voice carrying through a crackling microphone, speaking passionately about equality and the need to protect LGBTQ lives. Karim had been on his way to the bus stop, but he stopped in his tracks. Something in her confidence, in the way people cheered her words, planted an uncomfortable knot in his chest. He didn't smile, didn't clap. He just stared. His eyes scanned the crowd until they landed on Jorell and Mikah, standing near the front, clapping and laughing with others. It was an image he couldn't forget. In the days that followed, he replayed it over and over, but with each replay, his feelings shifted from mild discomfort to something darker. Karim had come to the UK hoping for safety after years of unrest in his home country. At first, he lived quietly in a cramped hostel, picking up work in kitchens and warehouses. But isolation soon wrapped around him like a chain. He spent more and more time online, drifting into chat groups that disguised hatred as truth. The people in these spaces told him his struggles were someone else's fault, that the freedoms celebrated here were corrupting society. They told him that people like Sariah, Jorell, and Mikah were enemies of morality. At first, he read silently, not interacting, but the words began to burrow into his mind. The community he found there didn't question his growing resentment. They fed it. The more he read, the more convinced he became that he had a purpose. Soon, his curiosity about the three friends turned into surveillance. He didn't know their names at first, only their faces, but that didn't stop him. He spotted Jorell outside his tattoo studio one evening and stood across the street, watching as customers came and went. A few days later, he saw Mikah performing at a drag event in a small club. Karim didn't go inside, but he lingered near the entrance long enough to hear the faint sound of cheers and music. Each sighting deepened his obsession. He began making notes in a small notebook describing what they wore, where they went, and how they interacted. The details were meticulous. Times, locations, even the bus routes they took. It wasn't chance anymore, it was deliberate. Karim's online world only encouraged him further. Videos, articles, and anonymous voices told him that bold acts were the way to earn respect, to prove loyalty to the ideology he was absorbing. He started thinking less about their humanity and more about how they could be turned into symbols. To him, they weren't people anymore. They were targets. In the quiet of his rented room, he rehearsed scenarios in his mind, telling himself it would be quick, that they wouldn't suffer. He convinced himself it was a mission, not a murder. When the festival day arrived, he knew they would be there. He had seen Sariah promoting it online weeks earlier and marked the date in his notebook. He spent the morning pacing his small room, the blinds drawn as if sunlight itself was an unwelcome intrusion. He packed a small folding knife into his jacket, tested its hinge, and slipped it back into place. There was no hesitation now, only the slow, simmering certainty that this was his moment. By early evening, he was already in the city center, blending into the growing crowd. Music thudded from multiple directions, and streams of people passed him without a second glance. He moved carefully, keeping his head down, but his eyes scanned constantly. He spotted them just after sundown, illuminated by a cluster of food stalls. They looked happy, talking animatedly and taking photos. Karim hung back, close enough to hear snatches of laughter, far enough to avoid attention. Every step they took, he mirrored at a distance, weaving through the crowd like a shadow tethered to them. As the hours slipped by, he watched them move from stage to stage, drink in hand, bodies relaxed. Each time they stopped, he stopped. When they danced, he stood still, his gaze locked on them. His plan was simple: wait until the crowds thinned and the noise softened, then strike without warning. Every detail was already in place in his mind, rehearsed in silence. He didn't think about the festival lights or the music anymore. All he could see was the narrow street where he intended to make his move. And as the night wore on, that street drew closer. The streets were beginning to thin out as the festival wound toward its quiet end. Food stalls closed one by one, music stages shut down their speakers, and the glitter and color of the night slowly gave way to dimly lit roads. Jorell, Mikah, and Sariah were among the last, still laughing as they left the final performance, their steps slightly unsteady from the drinks they had shared. They decided to skip the busy taxi rank near the main square, choosing instead to walk a few blocks to a quieter street where they thought they could catch a ride faster. It was a decision made without a second thought, one that brought them exactly where Karim wanted them. Karim had been following at a careful distance all night, never letting them out of his sight. He stayed to the edges of the crowd, his hood pulled low over his face. He'd already rehearsed the moment dozens of times in his head, but now, with the street ahead of them emptying out, the reality began to take shape. Every step he took was measured, his hands deep in his jacket pockets, one palm brushing against the cold handle of the folding knife. His breathing was steady. His eyes never wavered from the backs of their heads. The narrow street they turned into was darker than the others, lined with closed shops and empty windows reflecting the faint yellow glow of the street lamps. It was quiet enough now that he could hear the faint scrape of their shoes against the pavement. The friends were still chatting, lost in their own world, unaware that danger had moved closer. Karim quickened his pace slightly, closing the gap between them. He could see the loose thread on the hem of Jorell's jacket, the way Mikah's sequined scarf caught the light, the shape of Sariah's camera bag slung over her shoulder. These small details burned into his vision, not as human touches, but as markers, targets. He had no intention of speaking. His plan was built around silence. It happened faster than any of them could have reacted to. Karim's footsteps, once muffled, suddenly closed in with alarming speed. Before Jorell could even turn, the blade was in motion, flashing under the streetlight. The first strike landed deep, the shock freezing Jorell in place for only a second before his knees gave way. Mikah spun around, eyes wide, but they had no time to shout. The knife was already swinging again, cutting through the air toward them. Karim moved with precision, each motion fueled by weeks of festering hate. Sariah tried to bolt, her hand fumbling for her phone, but Karim's grip caught her arm like a vice. She twisted, desperate to break free, but he pulled her down hard, the knife striking with the same cold efficiency. Mikah lunged forward, trying to shove him off balance, but the effort only brought them closer to the blade. The sound of struggle lasted no more than a few breaths. Each movement was overpowered by the brutal speed of his attack. Within seconds, the street was a silent tableau, 3 bodies crumpled on the cold pavement, the life gone from them as quickly as it had been there. The night seemed to close in around the scene. The hum of distant music had faded entirely, replaced by an oppressive stillness. A few blocks away, laughter and voices still filled the air, but here it was as if the world had stopped. Karim stood over them for a moment, his chest rising and falling. He didn't run immediately. Instead, he looked down at the 3 friends as if confirming to himself that his mission was complete. The knife hung loosely in his hand, its blade dark under the weak streetlight. When he finally stepped back, his movements were deliberate, almost calm. He slipped the knife back into his pocket and turned away, his footsteps retreating into the shadows. He didn't glance over his shoulder, didn't stop to see if anyone had noticed. Behind him, the street remained eerily still, the bodies lying where they had fallen, their last moments stolen in less than 15 seconds. The world outside that narrow street was still alive, still unaware that a celebration had just turned into a tragedy. But soon, the silence here would be shattered by the sound of approaching footsteps, the first witnesses arriving too late to change what had just happened. Karim's escape began the moment he stepped out of the shadowed street, leaving the scene behind as though it were nothing more than a discarded memory. He kept his head down, blending into the late night trickle of pedestrians still making their way home from the festival. His stride was measured, not rushed, his breathing controlled so as not to draw attention. In his mind, the job was done. He had prepared for this moment, rehearsed it so thoroughly that even his exit felt like part of the script. His plan was simply get as far from the scene as possible before the first alarm was raised. Just 2 blocks away, the streets grew busier again, illuminated by bars spilling out the last of their customers. Karim threaded his way between groups of laughing strangers, their joy a strange contrast to the blood cooling on the pavement behind him. He crossed to a darker alley where an old metal door leaned open, disappearing inside for a moment. When he emerged again, he was wearing a different jacket, one he had stashed earlier in the day. The hood was gone, replaced by a cheap baseball cap. He stuffed the old jacket deep into a torn rubbish bag and left it behind a stack of crates. Now, to anyone glancing his way, he was just another man heading home after a long night. Meanwhile, back on the street where the attack had taken place, 2 young men leaving a nearby takeaway stumbled upon the scene. At first, they thought it was some drunken collapse, but as they drew closer, the stillness told them otherwise. One of them froze, the other fumbled for his phone, hands trembling. The emergency call went through, and within minutes the distant wail of sirens began to grow louder. Karim was already 4 streets away by then, his ears sharp enough to catch the faint sound, but his pace unchanged. He knew those sirens weren't for him yet. Not until the police understood what had happened. By the time the first patrol cars reached the scene, Karim had slipped through a series of side streets and emerged near the edge of the city center. Here, CCTV cameras dotted every corner, but he had studied their locations during earlier visits. He kept his face down, timing his walks so that his head turned slightly away when passing under each lens. From a bus stop, he crossed into a poorly lit underpass where the smell of damp and mildew clung to the air. In that cold, echoing tunnel, he removed his cap and shoved it into a drain, running a hand through his hair to change his appearance further. The manhunt began almost instantly once the severity of the crime became clear. Multiple witnesses from the festival described seeing a man in a dark jacket and hood lingering near the victims earlier in the night. Detectives pieced together the last movements of Jorell, Mikah, and Sariah using security footage and statements from friends. The timeline was tight, and the police knew they were dealing with someone who had planned their escape. Still, Karim had an advantage. He had chosen his hiding spots long before tonight. 2 hours after the attack, he was on the outskirts of the city, riding a stolen bicycle he had left chained behind a warehouse weeks earlier. The streets here were empty. The only sounds the faint hum of the tires on the tarmac and the occasional rustle of wind against corrugated metal. He pedaled steadily, avoiding main roads, weaving through industrial estates and back lanes. Every so often he glanced behind, though he knew no one was there yet. His phone, once a lifeline to the extremist channels that had consumed him, was gone, dropped into a public bin not long after he left the scene. Without it, there was no digital trail for the police to follow, only the faint thread of his physical movements. It wasn't until 48 hours later that his luck began to unravel. The police, having reviewed hours of surveillance footage, traced a pattern in his movements and realized he had been circling the same few streets near the industrial edge of the city. They sent plainclothes officers to watch the area, hoping he would surface. Karim, unaware of how close they were, had taken shelter in a derelict warehouse, sleeping in a corner behind stacks of rotting wooden pallets. It was there, on a damp and silent evening, that a homeless man spotted him while scavenging for scrap. The man's instincts told him something was wrong. The stranger didn't look like he belonged there, and the tension in his posture was impossible to miss. Later that night, he approached a police patrol and quietly shared what he'd seen. Within hours, the area was surrounded. The raid on the warehouse began just before dawn, when the city was still caught in the muted stillness between night and morning. A dozen armed officers moved in silence through the overgrown lot, their boots pressing into damp soil and scattered rubbish. The building loomed ahead, its brick walls blackened with age and its windows covered in grime. Inside, Karim was crouched in the shadows near a broken window, half awake, his mind heavy with the exhaustion of 2 days spent hiding. He had eaten nothing, drank only from a rusted water pipe in the corner, Yet his focus had not wavered. The knife, cleaned hastily with an old rag, remained in his grip, as if letting it go would strip away the last piece of control he had left. When the first beam of a torchlight cut through the gloom, Karim froze. He could hear them now, the deliberate steps, the faint creak of the front door being forced open, the low murmur of voices giving signals. For a moment, he considered running deeper into the building, but there was nowhere to go. The exits were covered, and he knew it. The sound of boots on concrete grew louder, and then the first officer appeared at the far end of the room. More followed, spreading out with weapons drawn. The light hit his face, and for the first time since the attack, Karim felt the thin thread of control slip. He didn't fight. He didn't shout. Instead, he lowered himself to his knees, still holding the knife, and waited for them to close in. The arrest was swift. Officers pulled his arms behind his back, the clink of handcuffs echoing in the cavernous space. Outside, the sun had begun to rise, casting pale gold across the wet pavement. Karim was led to a waiting van, his face expressionless, his eyes forward. He didn't ask why they were there, he already knew. The journey to the police station was silent, except for the hum of the engine. In his mind, he replayed the moments of the attack, not with regret, but with the cold detachment of someone recalling a task completed. Interrogation began within hours. Detectives placed photographs of Jorell, Mikah, and Sariah on the table in front of him, each image taken from happier times. They asked him to explain what had happened, but there was no hesitation in his answers. He spoke in a calm, flat tone, detailing how he had followed them, why he had chosen that night, and how he believed his actions were justified. There was no remorse, no flicker of doubt. He spoke as though reading from a script he had written for himself long ago. Investigators listened, some barely able to keep their composure as he described the attack in exact, chilling detail. The trial, when it came, drew intense public attention. The courtroom was packed with journalists, activists, and grieving friends. Security was tight, the atmosphere tense. Karim sat in the dock, expressionless, while the prosecution laid out the evidence, CCTV footage of him trailing the victims, witness statements placing him at the scene, the notebook filled with his observations, and the extremist materials found on his discarded phone. The defense had little to offer other than to confirm his radicalization and mental state. But the jury saw no reason to show mercy. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, Karim showed no reaction. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The families of Jorell, Mikah, and Sariah wept openly, clutching framed photographs of the lives they had lost. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered, holding candles and rainbow flags, turning the street into a sea of light and color. They weren't there only to mourn, but to demand action against the kind of hatred that had taken root in Karim's mind. In the weeks that followed, murals appeared across Bristol, each one painted with the smiling faces of the three friends. At night, people lit candles beneath them, leaving flowers and handwritten notes. Their deaths became a rallying cry, not only against hate crimes, but against the online spaces that had fed Karim's transformation from a quiet refugee into a cold-blooded killer. The images of Jorell's inked arms, Mikah's glittering stage outfits, and Sariah's bright, defiant smile lived on in the hearts of those who had known them. For the city, their absence was a wound that would never fully heal. For the world beyond, they became symbols of joy stolen, of love defying hate, and of the dangerous cost when prejudice turns into violence.